Languaging. Languaging, how it began, a spark at first, the light that brought us, and along with that, the dark. For where there is light, there is always some dark too, the shadows. This is part one of a two-part series. I want to begin by acknowledging and thanking my mentor, Umberto Maturana. Many of the ideas that are herein expressed are foundational from him, and of course, everyone continues with what they hear in their own path of reflections, but that does not mean I cannot fully acknowledge and appreciate the source from which many of this began, and the many other sources, the many conversations I have had. I see what I'm thinking of here as a network, a systemic network of understandings where everything influences everything else. So languaging is but one part that depends on systemic dynamics, cognition, learning, understanding evolution, emotioning, human origins, and as shown with the dotted lines, also distinctions, domains, culture, intangible. There's so much. And the thing is, language is a special thing. It is difficult to see it because we live embedded in it, according to the metaphor of fish do not see the water we're embedded in. So we learn languaging, already embedded in the languaging culture, in the languaging world. And we don't do it instantly. It takes a while. We generate our understanding of language. And we're not the only beings who can do this. My dog did learn quite a lot of language during her life with me. It isn't our coordinations with us that happens. So, in this presentation, in the two parts, I'm going to cover the biological context of its origin, how it came about through recursions of consensual coordination, I will explain, how then we have lineages of language, and also a kind of a side trip. How does observer and self-consciousness relate to language? And finally, an understanding again of how this is in a systemic relational embeddedness in our cultures, our worlds, our earth, and all the dynamics that take place. So starting with the biological context. I have a touchstone. It's an actual stone that I can refer to that sits on my desk, and on it I've drawn an image from Maturana. This image is an evocation, it's a token. It calls forth for me a lot of understanding, some of which I'll try and explain here. The circle represents a living system composing itself. It's an ongoing, connected circle, even though the arrow is shown here unconnected. And the black little line up under it is a symbol for its medium, its context, wherein it lives. A living system does things, it acts. It can act by moving or any behavior it does, and we call this the behavioral domain. It can also sense. It can sense the place where it's in, through anything from chemical sensation to acoustic and visual and all of those. When it acts, the medium is in some sense influenced. Even walking changes its relation to the medium which it can then sense. So environmental and social domains are also changed by some actions. And then the living system puts this all together through sensory effector coordination in its cognitive domain. Living systems, all living systems, are cognitive systems. That's how they manage to operate in the world in a way that's continuously adapting to their current situation. Now, an observer can look at the changes in the medium, an observer can look at the behavior, an observer may think they're looking at what the living system is thinking, but no, you can't do that. You can only impute what is happening by looking at the behavior in the context of the medium. In other words, you're bringing in a judgment of saying this being understands, and that may be a judgment on any living being or oneself, another person, a cat, anything. I'd like to call this sensory vector coordination, cohering for short, just as a mnemonic to remember it. And I also want to remind myself always that this is all happening in a continuous circularity with a background of continuous changes in the world we live in. But there's more circularities to consider, and for that I'm increasing the size of this picture so I can speak to it. For us, languaging beings, we have part of our cohering in language and in rational, logical thinking. We also have a deeper systemic thinking, deeper, broader, wider, fundamental, that we do not directly access in language. However, the language does influence the systemic thinking, and the systemic thinking does influence that language and rational thinking. Furthermore, all of this remains in recursion with our whole bodyhood, because our whole bodyhood is also a cognitive system, and this perhaps a simpler way. There is much more entailed than just that which we may call thinking, either systemic or rational. But the main thing is this is a circularity. And if you look at it, it's a circularity that interacts with other circularities, and many, many more that may not directly interact, but indirectly are all in a mesh, a network, a system of circular relationships, and this all in a dynamic background of further changes that may not be directly aware for any of these beings. I like to think about this as a systemic, dynamic, relational embeddedness for all beings, and in particular, it's nice to think of that for ourselves as human beings. So, the systemic, dynamic, relational embeddedness happens in a context. You see here a pattern. I think most of you will say this is a pattern of water. You'll see this beautiful series of reflections, and that's the phenomenon you're looking at. And we'll automatically call it reflections because we're automatically thinking about the generative domain. How did this come about? We say it's reflection, but that doesn't say it came from the red bridge in Nelson in a particular weather of the water being in a particular waveforms with the sun at a particular angle. We look at the process and the result, and we connect them with explanations. So I like to always go to both these domains to look at what is it that I'm seeing and how did it come about. If you look at language in the phenomenal domain, you'll be asking something about what is language. But what I'd like to do, and what I learned from Maturana, is to ask the question, what do we do when we language? And how did that begin? How did we do that? What do we do when we language in a systemic, dynamic, relational embeddedness? And as Maturana has said, languaging begins as a recursion in consensual coordination. Consensual coordination, what is that? Well, easiest explained with how birds fly in flocks, for example. They coordinate their flying with each other by sensing together, together, sensual sensing. And this allows to act in a kind of coordinated behavior without having to plan it or think it or rationalize it. It's kind of a way of being, a manner of living together that allows coordinated behavior, enables acting in harmony, and contributes to a biosphere of relational living. It creates a harmony in the biosphere. And we humans do it too. We do this automatically. We don't bump into each other in the street. We don't have to think about that. We are coherent in our conversations. We know when we're taking turns without having to even think about it. But back to consensual coordination. When it's repeating in a particular circumstance, repeating over and over again in a similar way, it comes to have a presence of its own. It comes to feel like this is something that is dependable that's happening. And when that happens, it's possible to do a further coordination on top of the coordination. You can do a gesture that evokes the coordination. In animals, this might be an attention movement, a slight nod that gives the other animals a signal that in this context, this nod means now we do. And thus, this becomes what we call a token. A token that has under it consensual coordination of consensual coordination. This is a recursion, something influencing itself and thereby being influenced. And what is interesting that when there is a token there, it obscures the consensual coordinations of the actions that it coordinates. You, when we have a token, we start saying it is a thing. But for the animal that does it, and before we have had to look at in language, it just did it. It is how things communicate nature. And I think in biosemiotics, this is known as the sign. I'm not an expert in that. I may be wrong, but I'd like to investigate that connection. In any case, a token, bringing in a token, is the beginning of languaging as a behavior. It is grounded in recurrence as becoming conserved. It enables collaboration as different from coordination. It enables living beings, for example, wolves, to hunt in packs. It is seen in animals and people. We see it in babies. Within their first year of life, they learn to do things according to gestures and sounds. It is really fundamental. And my dog learned it too, of course. Talking about, and my dog learned it too. She talked, she was playing with a stick, and very quickly over time, this recurrences of that token happened with increasing ease until it was very easy for me to say, "Where's your sticky?" And she would go somewhere in the world and find a stick so we could play it with the throwing game that dogs so much like. And eventually, this object persists as present. So, with that consensual coordination, that token, it becomes possible to do a further consensual coordination on top of the already existing one. Now, this is a mental step away from the original implicit referent. It is now a named object. This thing, this stick, has a name, and we can speak to it. And this is distinguishing and naming. It has within it two recursions, consensual coordination of consensual coordination of consensual coordination. And when we have this, we have a named object, which could be thing, an action, idea, anything, a gesture even. Well, I guess that is an action. But the funny thing, the important thing is that the name now enables us to refer for something outside the original context. As I said, my dog learned to think of a stick even when there was no stick around and go off hunting for one. Now, dogs don't easily communicate this recursion to each other, but they do learn it with us as we're living in language. But for us, the name enables us to refer something original out of the context, and we have begun with storytelling, being able to speak of something that isn't there in a way that evokes its presence. And of course, this has enabled a huge expansion in language. So what happens is that every distinction is grounded in and reveals some regularity in our experiences. Here I'm using a little metaphor of seeing the rabbit pellets, distinguish them from the background in this array of mosses and sticks and heather. But when we make a distinction, it also has the propensity of taking our attention away from the others, so other things are obscured. Other distinctions we could have made with the same objects, even. We could have talked about color values, we could have talked about shapes, but we've looked at rabbit pellets, and rabbit pellets are now insignificant. And if you do this enough, this distinction that reveals an obscurity of others, sometimes to the point of invisibility, to the point that they are not part of our awareness within the particular language and culture that we live. Indeed, this is part of why it is that we live embedded in language so in such a way we don't even see the consequences. And some of these significant consequences is that when a distinction repeatedly arises through conserved behavior, it requires a presence and endures, just as I've seen. But added to that, for us, it accretes, gains to itself an ontological existence. It's really there. It's a thing. So it remains there as a thing in our lives. And as we conserve these things, these distinctions, from generation to generation, in various networks, we end up with ecologies of related distinctions that we realize as cultures. And these networks of distinctions are implicitly accepted as reality in any particular culture. Now, leads you to some deep thoughts if you wish to take it there. But for now, let us just say that humans live in language in a way that we often do not see ourselves living in language. Yet it is interesting to reflect how that came to be and what that implies in our lives. I will continue this in part 2.